Hello, everyone. Today I have in Econ Lab with the expert, Dr. Tim Ginker. He's an econometrician at the Bank of Israel, and his field of interest are applied macroeconomics and time series forecasting. So today he's here to walk us through a paper that he co-authored with Itamar Caspi, which is entitled "What Drives the Scenario? Interpreting Conditional Forecast in Reduced Form VARs." So hello, Tim. Thank you for participating in today's tutorial. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself, what you're doing currently, and your fields of interest, and then we are going to proceed with your paper.
Okay. First of all, really appreciate the opportunity for being here, and thank you for the invitation. It's sometimes when you present at a conference, so you typically meet only 20 people, and I think that you do allow a much broader coverage, and I really appreciate that. For the last 6 years, I work as an econometrician at the Bank of Israel. So my main focus is forecasting, like a variety of tasks: short-term forecasting, long-term forecasting, scenario analysis. I also worked on things that are more related to official statistics, like seasonal adjustment, but of high-frequency data. But it was a sort of a side project for me. I kind of worked then on developing a high-frequency indicator of economic activity, and suddenly found that there are no R packages for seasonal adjustment of weekly data, and so I did. I just developed something by myself, and I also really like reproducible research. So that's why I think it is very important to make any model, anything you do, as much reproducible as possible, because especially if you work in a big organization, because using someone else's codes that someone else has written, I don't know, 5 years ago, and now you're trying to understand how it works. So again, I'm trying, at least in my work, I'm trying to introduce as much as possible this approach of creating packages and also sharing with other people. It's not today in the current R infrastructure, it's not that difficult to take the tools that you develop and make them, and create a package of it and share with other people. It's also for your own benefit, because I got a lot of feedback. Okay, and people also can help you to find errors and improve it. So
absolutely,
that's really nice. Well, I finished PhD in 2022 in time series econometrics, but my PhD was mainly theoretical. Yes, so basically that's it.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you very much for sharing a bit of your background. And now maybe we can discuss or tell the audience a little bit of what we're going to see today, which is conditional forecasting. So just to give some broader background to the people, normally we work with structural models, or we try to impose a couple of assumptions about the outcome of a variable, of an endogenous variable in the model, and we say, hey, what happens if, I don't know, the oil prices go up? What's going to happen with inflation? And we try to make a forecast conditional on certain assumptions of the model. So is this a little bit what you're going to introduce us today? So maybe you can talk about this paper, and we can start with this presentation and discuss a little bit how you do this with your R package.
I'll probably start with the definitions. Just a second, I'll share my screen. Of course, I have to read the disclaimer that I'm representing here only my views and do not represent the Bank of Israel or my other employers. So let's start with the definition. And in a multivariate system, conditional forecasts are projections for a subset of target variables, conditional on the assumed future path for another set of conditioning variables. Such forecasts are routinely produced by major public and financial institutions for key macroeconomic aggregates like inflation or GDP. For instance, conditioned on the oil prices or interest rates. And these forecasts are typically generated using structural models and judgment. Structural models allow a coherent mapping from economic narratives and judgment to focused outcomes. But they're also found to be very sensitive to identification assumptions and sample variation. And that's why it became a standard practice to cross-check them with reduced form VARs, typically in a Bayesian form. And these models are robust and easy to implement, but lack causal interpretation. So, in the absence of structural identification, we cannot use like things like orthogonalized impulse-response functions or variance decompositions. So what is typically done is conditional forecast from reduced form models are typically evaluated based on their out-of-sample accuracy. And this can be done in two ways. We can use the actual realizations of the conditioning variables to assess the information content of our conditioning set, and the ability of the model to translate this information into accurate forecasts. Alternatively, we, if possible, of course, can use the real-time assumptions, and this allows us to assess the real-time accuracy and performance of the model. And here we have a major limitation. This focus on accuracy mixes two things. Basically, how much the model cares about a particular variable or a particular set of variables that we are conditioning on, and how much these variables happen to move within our sample. And this motivates the need for new tools that allow us to better, let's say, quantify, design, and communicate our scenario assumptions in reduced form models. And so conditional forecasts can be generated using Kalman filter, more specifically the Kalman smoother. And in this representation, they can be written as a weighted sum of the observed data plus the imposed future path. So, and the weights can be extracted using the algorithm proposed by Koopman and Harvey. And these weights were already employed in the context of nowcasting and dynamic factor analysis by Banbura and Ranslev. And we extend this analysis to conditional forecasting with reduced form VARs. So we do a number of things, apart from obviously decompositions. It's also important to know before you start working on scenarios if your conditioning variables matter at all. So we introduce horizon-specific measures of overall and marginal importance. By overall, I mean like all data available, and marginal, we focus only on the conditioning variables to assess the sensitivity of the model to conditioning assumptions. And in addition, we have some theoretical contribution as well. So we link those weights from the Kalman filter to generalized impulse response functions. So, and we show when the things are equivalent and where are not. And finally, everything is implemented in an R package called cforecast. It is available on CRAN, and there is also a development version on GitHub.
Perfect.
Yeah. So I think it would be nice to start from a practical illustration and leave the formal definitions for the end.
Yes.
So Yeah, so here is an illustrative example from the paper. We estimate a 5-variable VR with GDP growth, core inflation, policy rate, credit spread, and oil price. And we are interested in the effect of a major geopolitical shock, resulting in a sharp increase in oil prices and the credit spread, followed by a gradual normalization. So as you can, everything like is illustrated here on the right. So solid lines represent the historical data. Dashed lines represent our scenario assumptions. And the dots represent unconditional forecasts obtained from our estimated VR model. So by unconditional, I mean that so we impose no future assumptions, just roll it forward. And a natural starting point here will be to kind of analyze which variables are important, if our conditioning set matters at all, and kind of get a sense of how like the transmission works when we do not impose any structure. So this can be done by analyzing the relative magnitude of the weights that I discussed before, of course properly scaled. And to do so, we only need to specify which variables are going to be constrained, and we don't need to provide the exact constraints. So we just ex ante say, well, we're going to constrain these two variables. Let's look at the relative magnitude by horizon of our conditional focus weights. And so let's start with the variables that we make no assumptions about. For instance, GDP. It can be barely seen here, and it's also quite consistent with the literature saying that pass-through activity has very limited power in predicting inflation. And also, if we look at the federal funds, its influence peaks somewhere between the fourth and the sixth quarter. Again, we did not constrain it in our scenario, and it's also quite consistent with the findings typically documented in the literature. So it's also kind of makes sense. Finally, let's look at the oil price. Its influence and its weight are growing gradually, reflecting the indirect nature of the impact of oil prices on the core inflation index, which, to remind to our listeners, core inflation excludes the energy prices. Yes. So it is, so it is affected only indirectly, and this is what we see here. All right. So finally, credit spread has a very significant weight, and it's quite kind of dominating here, which is also consistent with the literature. Okay. So again, it's kind of in reduced form models, it's very difficult to make any causal interpretation. But as you can see here, overall, the dynamics that we've estimated makes a lot of sense, right? Which is good. But also seeing things that make no sense is good as well. It says you something. So I think no matter what result you get, so whether you reinforce your confidence in the model, or alternatively you find that it doesn't make sense what you see, so it's still good. And so it also might be useful in cases where you have some, I don't know, some crisis or major event, and you might identify that things are shifting. Suddenly, some variables become like too heavy here, too expressed in the decomposition. So it might guide you how to how to deal with this. Outliers or critical events. So
correct.
Yeah, so I think it might be very useful. It's also very easy to compute, and I think that at least intuitively, so for any horizon, your conditional focus is just a weighted sum of all your inputs, including your scenario assumptions. So it's just one-to-one mapping here. So kind of I find it to be very intuitive, and so let's go to the forecast itself. So on the left, again, you see the core inflation and its historical data as a solid line. The dashed line is our conditional forecast, and the dots are related to the unconditional forecast. So, and on the right, you see its decomposition. So what we can see is that that the surge in the credit spread creates a significant disinflationary pressure immediately, and also in our scenario, it normalized somewhere above where it started, so it kind of continues to have this disinflationary pressure, and the effect of oil price surge builds up gradually and also kind of remains here, but and then starts to decline. But its effect is mainly because of the magnitude of our scenario assumptions and not because of how the model sees it, because of the importance that model assigns to it. So kind of we can combine these two things, and also it can guide you. So I kind of to answer this question, I need to say assume that so if I would say differently. So if I wanted to assess whether I need to make any assumptions on GDP, I could regenerate this plot, assuming that we are conditioning on GDP as well. Of course, it's not going to change much. I already tried in the past. And it might guide you in your scenario design that you don't need to care much about certain variables, or if there is no drama in oil prices, you don't need to work hard to create a scenario and explain it. So it kind of also can make the whole process of scenario design much more transparent and easier. So of course, this can be taken a few steps further. We demonstrate it in the paper. So you can drill down in the analysis of weights and eventually quantify redundancies and even maybe remove some scenario assumptions and get almost the same outcome. So those things I think simplify greatly the scenario design. It's much better than you have some the situation when you have some, for instance, conditional focus from structural model, and you want to use a reduced form model as a benchmark, and all you have is just a number. So a structural model gives you 0.7, and here you have 0.3. So it kind of helps a lot to see where it comes from.
Right.
And yeah, and but again, we cannot make any kind of causal interpretations here. It's again, it's using reduced form models is we still have all the limitations of reduced form models, right? So we just can kind of open this black box and just see better where how our scenario is constructed, what are the weights of our assumptions, and whether it makes sense, but it's kind of less formal compared to structural models. And another limitation, I think that sometimes you miss in your assumptions and your focus, and you need to be able to learn from the past.
Right.
And structure helps you to provide causal interpretations and also analyze the past.
Correct.
and learn from it. So here you kind of quite limited in this respect. Of course, in like out of sample analysis, you still can use decompositions and see which variables played the major role in each period, and it might guide you, but it of course remains to be less formal and kind of less precise, less elegant. So, but not that we have other options. So again, if you are using reduced form benchmarks, this is still something helpful. It helps you in your scenario design, and it's better than having just a headline number, 0.7. That's it.
Right. Correct. So Tim, maybe just correct me if I misunderstand this, but the general image here is that normally we rely on a structural form. In this particular case, we are departing from that. We are still relying on reduced form bar. You maybe give up the causal interpretation. Always the constraints with a structural model is that the underlying assumptions that you are making about the relationship between these variables is the correct one, which is always something that is debatable. But this other alternative that you're looking at here with the reduced form bar is a way more simple, transparent way, and still with using these weights from the filter, you can understand what's driving these forecast scenarios, correct?
Yes, indeed. Also, I need to point out, it's an important point indeed, the way you construct structural scenarios and the way scenarios are constructed here, it's kind of different. So, and it has a completely different interpretation. So, there is a nice example given by, I think I cite this paper, by Antolin Diaz in the context of I think it was inflation, and it was a very simple illustrative example consisting of GDP, inflation, and the policy rate. So, and he showed two options. So, one time you assume that so you ask two types of questions. So, you might ask what are the most likely paths for GDP and inflation if the policy rate was around 1%. Okay, this is one question. And this is a question you're answering with a reduced form VR without imposing structure. An alternative question is suppose that the central bank is going to keep the policy rate at 1%. What are going to be the path of the GDP and inflation? So in the second example, the conditional forecast is generated using monetary shocks. So you just like less formally, we can look at so we estimate a structural model, all right, go to reduced form, make a forecast one step ahead, all right, and then look at the federal funds rate, for instance, and relative to what we want it to be, all right, and then we add a monetary shock and distribute it within a system using the structure that we've estimated, all right, and treat this new observation as the real one, right? And we proceed in that way, like how many periods ahead we need. So you generate your scenario by an appropriate sequence of monetary shocks. And this is quite different from the reduced form model, where it's kind of it's not taking into account any structure. So you're going to get different results. It's also, you need to be very, again, in the monetary context, I think it's kind of more difficult than in real context, because consider like oil prices. They kind of can grow because of the surge in global demand, but they also can grow because of what's happening now. So you have different reasons and different source of the shock. to the oil price, which should be introduced differently. And you cannot make this distinction in reduced form VARs.
Correct.
So, so it still has limitations, but in real context, for instance, in a small open economy like Israel, if you're like conditioning on global demand, oil prices, I don't know, labor market indicators, sectoral indicators, it's like more straightforward. So you have like less cases of such ambiguity. But you still need to be careful, and again, I think the decompositions and also combined with the structural model allow you to see these points and to generate and to apply your judgment, all right, in a more informed way after that.
Absolutely. Oh, okay, there we go. Yeah.
So again, so this is a formal part, but I'm not diving into the derivation. So I'm trying to keep it simple. So we consider a standard VR model, so it's let's think of a forecast S periods ahead. So we are talking about constraining some values of future Y's and getting the forecast, and it can be written as just a weighted sum of all the inputs. Okay, you can for variables that are not constrained in the future, you can set them to NAs and their weights to zeros, right, or NAs as well. So again, so that's it. It's just a weighted average of all the data you have. And so now I connect it to generalized impulse response functions. So if we assume stationarity, our VR has a MA representation, as I show here. And just to remind, generalized impulse response function is can be interpreted as a conditional expectation of yt plus s when you have a shock of delta j to ujt is the noise of to j's equation at time t, and all the past data minus conditional expectation, which is conditioned only on the past data, right? So, and it's very simple to derive because assuming normality or using the optimal projection properties, conditional expectation of all the vector of disturbances ut given the shock to its j's value is given by this expression, and to get the generalized impulse response function, we only need to multiply it by the appropriate MA coefficient. So that's it. And so here I formalize what we actually do in conditional forecasting. So let's take all the future variables of y up to our forecasting horizon h and stack them in the vector, and we can use a selection matrix S to pick the parts of it that we are going to constrain, and delta cy represents the constraints themselves. Okay, so again we see the same expression as here, just a bit more formalized. And we also, instead of using generalized impulse response functions, we can look at the weights assigned to our constrained observations. Correct. All right, so you see kind of many indexes here. So, so basically, there are more nuances here because you can constrain, you can make an assumption about the future of some variable s periods ahead. right? Or I'm talking here more specifically about L periods ahead, all right? And by constraining the level, you're imposing constraints on, like through a MA representation going back on the past shocks, on you know, like multiplied by the coefficients. So you do not constrain a single U, you constrain some weighted sum of U's. And it's kind of different. So by doing so, you're going to have an effect of your constraint also backwards and also forwards. So it's a two-way effect now. And so you might focus on the weights and the horizons affected, all right? So here, for example, this focus is kind of more general than looking at generalized impulse response function. And I think it's more intuitive. You just assume that some y is going to have a particular value, and you just look at its weight at different horizons, all right? So just to remind you, we are focusing H periods ahead, all right? And we are considering the effect of constraining the J's value, L periods ahead on the focused S periods ahead. So as I said earlier, you might constrain something 5 periods ahead, but it's going to affect your focused 1 period ahead. So S is kind of 1 and L is 5 in this context, all right?
Okay.
And it was kind of up until now, it was very technical and algorithmical, and I wanted to see if these weights resemble something that we know from the theory. And we analytically were able to show that if you are considering constraining only a single variable 1 period ahead, its weight for any horizon would coincide with GRF.
Okay.
Okay, and in all other setups, it's not going to coincide, but still it provides a more general way to quantify its effects without imposing structure. So this is a theoretical result that shows you that basically it's kind of connected to the well-known things in certain cases. So, and finally, about marginal importance and overall importance. So you can analyze the relative magnitude of the weights assigned to different variables, all right? So you can take a total weight, take into account like the full sample, I mean the imposed path plus the observed data, or you might focus only on the parts related to your imposed assumptions. So this also gives you some guidance that, so I did not report it here. So I only show the division, but we might focus on the same division of the weights assigned to the scenario parts. So, and you might divide it by the total weights and see like how sensitive your total forecast to your scenario. So in our case, it is 40%. But for instance, if it was only 2%, it would mean that your future is described almost by the history. So you don't need to bother about constraints. They're not going to change anything again. So it again provides a simple guidance. I just decided to save space here because it kind of looks boring because I constrain only 2 variables. So when you have a more elaborate form of constraint, it could be worth analyzing as well. So this is
Perfect.
The main findings in our paper. I hope you find it interesting. And now I can go to Econ repositories and show you the technical side of it. So first of all, just a side note about state space models. They're kind of very general, but for me, up until a certain point, it was kind of very vague how it works. because you kind of have one equation where you specify how your observed data are connected to some unobserved thing that you are interested in, and then you specify the dynamics of these unobserved components, and that's it. So it's kind of very general, but you have no guidance or no simple way to show how it works under the. So you just, we have a few algorithms, write maybe a few lines of code and then get a result. So, but kind of it wasn't intuitive as a regression or other models. It was very vague. So, but if you look at it from perspective of Kalman and Harvey, that shows that those unobserved components can be written as a weighted sum of all your observables. It makes a lot of sense now. So it's kind of easier to see, and it's very easy to derive these weights. I was surprised that there was no package for it. So I also made it public.
That's great. Yeah.
So so here is just a simple illustrative example based on the flow of the Nile River. So you can see it as a gray line, the regional data. Suppose that we just want to smooth it and to get some local level. And of course, there is a well-known local level model in state space form, but what it does under the hood, all right? So basically, you can create from it like two lines. One represents the smooth level, and the second one here represents the black one represents the filtered level, and which I denote here by alpha t. Okay, and this alpha t is just again a weighted average of the observed data, and the same is true for the filtered level. So let's focus on some point here, okay, and just see how it can be generated. So in this package, what you can do, you need to provide the state space form, all right, and the data plus the index you are interested in. So I focused on the 50th point and derived the weights. Okay, that's like quite simple. So and then I visualize them. So for instance, smoothing takes all the data and it's kind of looks symmetric, and filtering takes only the data up to the point. Again, so you take these weights, you multiply it by the data, and you get these lines.
Yeah.
So and also you see that filtering is one-sided. That's why you see this phase shift, that peaks are kind of shifted, and filtering is one-sided and smoothing is not suffering from this problem. So again, it now makes it more transparent, I think. So another small example that I provide here is a dynamic factor model that also easy to decompose using this package. So in a dynamic factor model, for instance, if you take like any series, any indicators represented the economies, they are going to be correlated. So here you assume that they are correlated from some common component. We might call it the index of economic activity or whatever, and which is not observed, and you derive it using the Kalman filter. So so what I did here, I took 10 series represented the Israeli economy and normalized them and plotted here as this gray area, and this blue line represents the factor itself that we derive. So which represents the co-movement between the series. And in economics, it's the number itself is not important. What is important is the story behind it and our ability to explain it. So we, for instance, if we report like that here we have a value of 0.2, where it comes from. So it's very easy to decompose as well, and then you can show that it was positively affected by industrial production and trade revenue, but we have, I don't know, weak job openings and other things. So you can present here an economic narrative.
Right.
And the package that works with conditional forecasts in VARs is basically built on the package that I just presented. So again, there is a lot of code here and explanations in the GitHub repo. Here in the first part, I just estimate
you fit the
VAR
VAR
model.
You just fit the VAR model there.
Yes, with VARs, nothing really particular. So Fred macro is the data set included in the package. I downloaded it from Fred, obviously. So again, and I make a base prediction. Then again, there is a long code, but it's all kind of aimed at generating a scenario and plotting it. And plotting is messy and long, but there is
yes,
nothing
it is,
conceptual here, really. So, and here we can see the scenarios that I showed before. Okay, now we go to the package capabilities. First of all, we might compute the variable importance. And it is done using variable importance stat. Stat means stationary. So it works well with stationary data because it's very easy to deal with the level. When the series are not stationary, it's kind of more complex. I have I have a function that is called variable importance level, but it needs some refinements because so it's kind of it's more difficult, okay, to analyze non-stationary data in this context. So again, what you need is to provide your fitted model to specify which variables you are interested in conditioning, to specify which one is your target variable and what is your maximal horizon. That's it.
And this is gradual. It does the adjustment. It's gradual, Tim. The adjustment of the
Sorry,
impose.
what?
Is it gradual? The adjustment of the conditional structure you're imposing. For example, you say, hey, I don't know, what happens if oil prices go up 20%? Is that a sudden shock, or how that's over a horizon? Smooth over a horizon.
At this point, you don't need to specify anything because, after all, your conditional forecast is just a weighted sum. Okay. So here I just focus on weights, and to generate these weights, you only need to specify which variables are going to be constrained. And for how long. That's it.
Okay.
Nothing more.
Perfect.
So yeah, so it's very useful before you proceed to scenario design, because sometimes scenario design can be complex as well. So before you start all this long work, you can in a minute check if it's worth anything. Okay. So now again, this is just a visualization part. This function is going to give you two data frames. For overall importance, when you take into account all weights, and to marginal importance, where you only take into account your imposed future past weights compared to the total. So,
okay, I see.
So that's it. You can visualize it. Here you have an example. You can just take it and it will automatically take your column names and generate such plot. And again, marginal importance looks like this. I forgot to cancel normalization. So, but again, it effectively shows you that your scenario is dominated by the credit spread, and oil prices are kind of less important here. If there is no drama, you don't need to care much about considering alternative designs. Okay. And if you're not normalizing it, you see that the overall weight is going to be like 40% of the total. So it is kind of sizable, but history is important as well. So now we go to a conditional forecast itself.
Okay. Yeah.
So, to generate a conditional forecast, again, you need to provide the matrix with your constraints.
Right.
Okay, if you're constraining like two variables, you just give a matrix with two columns, like here. So you provide the fitted model, you provide the conditional path, and you also need to specify which columns in the conditional path are constrained. So here we constrain fourth and fifth variable, so it also needs to be provided. And as an output, you get all sorts of things. So, and in computations that are done under the hood, I made it mainly for myself to be able to generate other functions from it. But you also can get the forecast itself, and that's it. So again,
Great.
it's very straightforward.
Very straightforward. Yes. Very easy to implement.
Yes. So and finally, we turn to the forecast composition. So you need to provide it, which decomposes your forecast into the influence of each variable. So you need to provide it your conditional forecast object and specify which target variable you wish to decompose. And again, that's it, basically. Okay, and after that, it's kind of very easy to visualize. So again, plots look a bit messy and long, but there is nothing,
it's more the syntax of the plot itself than the difficulty of the code, for sure. Yeah.
Indeed, there is nothing fundamental here.
Yeah,
again.
correct.
So these are the main capabilities. So I wanted to know that I have, like, if you want to customize things, you can access functions like state space representation, which returns you the state space representation itself. You can, there is a function that generates the forecast weights. You can also use it. And also I wanted to know that everything is built here on FKF, which is a fast Kalman filter, and its algorithm requires that the forecast error variance should be non-singular, and it's not always met, especially when you're working with levels. So I added another backend to WEX, to weight extractor, which is now can be more robust and does not require this invertibility. But I'm still working on introducing it to cforecast, so I hope it will take a week or two. So if you are getting errors that something is singular, I'm going to fix this like in a week or so. I don't know when I push it to CRAN, but the development version will be available here from GitHub. You can install it from here.
Awesome. That's fantastic. And also I'm letting the audience know that I have provided all the links. So you guys, when you get into my repository, you're going to find the links that Tim has shared today, so you can get access to his repository and be able to replicate all this fantastic approach. Now, thank you so much for this demonstration, guys. I think honestly, it's a quite straightforward conditional forecast package that here Tim has introduced to us. So it's great if you go ahead, copy, and just replicate at least the results that he finds, and then you are able to play around with some other variables. So now maybe I have a couple of questions that come to my mind.
It is important for me to make a remark.
Mm-hmm.
It's aimed to be a fast starting point.
Right.
By no means it meant to replace structural models. Again, it's just a more transparent benchmark. That's it.
That's right. Exactly. Well, that was gonna be my first question. Indeed, I have here my tablet with a couple of questions that I wrote down. So my question was going to be how does this complement the structural models like DSG models, for example? Now, I mean, you are into forecasting, and you like forecasting and stuff. And now my questions are, What's normally the most common approach? I understand DSG models are quite complex. They have a lot of equations, a lot of you can make mistakes everywhere. I think there's a bunch. It's a quite difficult job for only one individual to work on, especially depending on the complexity of what is being requested. Right? Normally it's not just a three new Keynesian DSG model. Normally a bunch of assumptions, external sector, and stuff like this. So these are quite complex models. So the question was going to be that how does this complement stuff like even structural VARs and stuff, and if it's just a substitute or a cross check. So that was the question indeed. So I read it for you. You already answered it, I think.
Yes. So it's just a cross check again,
Yeah.
and I think
you
see that structural models they are restricted also in the variables that are there, and especially at the time of distress, some transmission mechanisms might not work as you expect. So you maybe need to make a quick adjustment.
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult in this way.
Right.
Also, anyone who worked with such models cannot not to notice how sensitive they are to the sample. That's another limitation. So this motivates the need for robust benchmarks. So this agility, you can run a smaller model, you can put only the things that you're interested in the minimal set of controls and get some result, and which is going to be a good benchmark. And now you also can make it more transparent and easier to interpret. So and to compare with your structural model. So.
Okay, perfect. So then I was going to ask some questions that have to do with performance. Then is looking at the forecast that you produce with this reduced form bar and stuff. Is how does this approach compare to other models in terms of accuracy when we are looking at forecasts, and also is the goal here more about interpretability than accuracy in the outcomes, or both things? Maybe you can just briefly.
Well, I just there's a nice paper by Angelini.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce the name. From the ECB, Mind the Gap, where they use reduced form benchmarks to make forecasts for the Eurozone with reduced form benchmarks. I also I don't remember the title. There's a nice paper from the Bank of England, I think, where they used it. So Angelini showed that it improves a lot, actually. So again, you can get more accuracy at the cost of explainability.
Right.
But from my experience, it works best for real economic activity like GDP and other things, because you have less controversy with your conditioning assumptions. I'll give you an example maybe from nowcasting. So it's somewhat unrelated, but again, when you use dynamic factors, there is no structure and stuff. And for instance, impairs from national accounts identity enter with a negative sign. But in your dynamic factor, it's going to be it's going to have positive effects on your economy. Why is that? Because you are looking at correlation, not sort of causation. Because kind of if your economy is growing, your consumption is growing, and you are importing more, and suddenly you find this positive correlation. So, but for instance, if there is some disruption, like some security-related issues that we have and that imposed constraints on our labor market, and this was compensated by more imports. So this sudden surge in imports might give you a higher nowcast value. So if you are able to decompose it and to see its effect, and also if you're aware of this like economic background and this explanation, so you can judgmentally adjust your forecast and get better results. So without structure, you cannot deal with such things. So kind of structure allows you to deal with demand side, supply side shocks. Without it, you cannot. So, and this kind of discussion is crucial in the monetary context. So
Absolutely.
I kind of, from what I saw in the literature and from my experience as well, reduced form approach gives decent results and it's less controversial in the context of real economy, but things become more difficult in the context of monetary economy.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And that does make sense. So maybe I guess I could ask you a bunch of questions, but maybe just the last one. I don't want to keep you for so long. But now this question now I have for you has to do more with normally what we put in a research paper that are next steps. Any researcher, any student who's working on looking at conditional forecastings, looking at the literature. I'm going to provide all the audience here the way to cite Tim's work and also how to cite his package in R. So any student who is curious about this topic, cares about researching more, taking a deeper look into this, what are some of the spectrums that you see room for this, and also to provide you feedback even with your package. Like you said, if you find any anomalies in my package, any room for improvement, what things could you tell to the audience that I think that they do care about these aspects as well?
Well, I personally think that the theoretical side can be greatly expanded here. So I just, in the paper, I just show how to simplify things and just, originally the algorithm of deriving waste is kind of just some recursion and you
right.
just find analytical solution. So it might give a rise for more efficient ways, maybe, for constructing forecasts and the analysis. In the Bayesian context, I think there's more work. For now, I don't have a full Bayesian implementation. What I did is computing the same things for the median of the posterior distribution because it's kind of very computationally demanding. So,
right.
Well, there are many works on conditional focusing, honestly, not necessarily related to what I do. I think there will be a lot of work in this topic anyway, but of course, anyone working on policy, working on real data have a huge advantage because, again, you feel it, it gives you ideas. I personally came to this idea because I found, again, no packages. So I decided, so why not? I'll do something myself.
Right, very useful. Well, I do appreciate so much, Tim, all your work here and sharing to the audience this package and walking us through your paper. So that's very valuable. And well, thank you very much for this presentation.
Thank you for the invitation. I really enjoyed presenting here.
Perfect.